And today we are embarking on a journey that I think fundamentally alters how you view justice, punishment, and even your own modern life.
It's a big one.
It is. We are diving deep into Michel Foucault's 1975 seminal work, Discipline and Punish: The Birth of the Prison.
A truly monumental text. And Foucault himself, born in Poitiers, France in 1926, he was one of the 20th century's most critical thinkers. He lectured all over the world.
Right, held director positions and finally held that prestigious chair in the history of systems of thought at the Collège de France until his death in 1984.
And this book, it throws down a serious challenge. Foucault's central question isn't the one we'd expect. It's not why punishment became less cruel.
We just sort of assume that's, humanitarian progress, the story of us getting better.
Exactly. His real mission is to ask something much more unsettling. How did Western society, in the short span of about 80 years, transition from a system of public, spectacular destruction of the body
to a system of imprisonment focused entirely on reforming the individual's mind and, well, their soul?
That transition is almost unbelievable in its speed and its completeness. To set the stage, Foucault gives us two historical snapshots, and the contrast is genuinely shocking.
It really is. The first image is that ritualistic, almost grotesque public execution from the 18th century. It's all about demonstrating the king's vengeful power.
And the second image, less than 100 years later, is the hyper-detailed bureaucratic timetable of a modern prison. He uses the Maison Centrale at Rennes as the example.
Let's just focus on that timetable for a second because it really captures the entire shift.
It's all there. We're talking about rules laid out in Articles 20 through 28, and they regulate life down to the absolute minute. It's a mechanized existence.
Precisely. The day begins. Prisoners have to wash their hands and faces. They get a small ration of bread. Then the collective work teams form. Work starts at 6 a.m., sharp in the summer, 7 in the winter.
And the whole day is just managed with this military precision. 10 o'clock is dinner, but before that, another enforced hand washing.
Then there's a short recreation period, but even that is carefully walled off, only until 20 minutes to 11.
And at 20 to 11, you hear a drum roll.
A drum roll. And they proceed in these ordered divisions to the school. This isn't optional. It's 2 full hours of reading, writing, drawing, and arithmetic. It's actually part of the sentence itself.
Then it's back to work until 4. Another meal, another regulated break. Evening work stops at 7 or 8, depending on the season. And then before lights out, there's 15 minutes of mandatory instructional or uplifting reading.
And then evening prayer.
Right, then prayer.
Finally, the signal for bed. 2 drum rolls. Undress, get into bed. Supervisors are patrolling to make sure there's total silence, total order.
So what this comparison shows you, the listener, is not just a change in, leniency. It's a massive redistribution of the entire economy of punishment.
That's the key word, economy. We went from punishing the visible crime on the physical body to punishing and reforming the hidden delinquent subject through the total management of their time and behavior.
So let's begin where Foucault begins. With the system that was abolished, we're in part 1 now, exploring the ritual of torture and that huge penal shift between, 1760 and 1840?
Roughly, yes. And that shift established a radically new age for penal justice all across Europe.
The speed of it is what's so wild.
It is key. Across the West, you see these old local laws just tossed out and new modern penal codes drawn up in Russia, Prussia, Austria, and of course revolutionary France in 1791.
And they all had one thing in common.
The formal disappearance of public torture as a primary spectacle. It just vanishes from the law books.
Now, a critical point Foucault makes right away is that punishment didn't stop affecting the body. That's a misunderstanding. It just changed the nature of that intervention.
Right. So if we're not torturing the body anymore, what is the body in the modern penal system?
It becomes an instrument.
An instrument, or maybe an intermediary. Think about imprisonment. Yes, it physically confines the body, but the punishment is abstract. You're deprived of liberty, which the modern social contract defines as a fundamental right, like a form of property.
And forced labor. It's physical, sure, but the punishment isn't the pain, it's the loss of your free time, the theft of your utility.
Exactly. The intervention on the body shifts from being a display of sovereign vengeance to an exercise in creating a new political economy of the body.
A political economy of the body. Let's unpack that.
The focus moves completely away from vengeance and toward utility and obedience. The new system is constantly asking, how can we invest in the body politically and economically to make it more productive?
More useful, more easily controlled.
How do we maximize its force while minimizing its rebellious power? That is the absolute core of what Foucault calls the political anatomy of the body.
And this shift is what opens the door for the truly modern object of punishment, the soul of the delinquent.
It's such a powerful and almost paradoxical claim. Foucault argues that the true target of modern punishment is not the body, but this non-corporal thing, the soul.
But not the soul in a religious sense.
Not at all. This soul isn't some pre-existing spiritual essence. He writes that this soul is real, non-corporal, and it's the element in which are articulated the effects of a certain type of power and the reference of a certain type of knowledge.
So if I'm getting this right, the soul isn't what we're trying to save. The soul is what's being fabricated by the modern system.
That is the great inversion. The soul is manufactured. It's built by surveillance, by discipline, by psychiatric diagnosis, by constraint, by pedagogy. We are no longer punishing the crime. We are diagnosing and correcting the soul, the criminal character.
So the whole humanitarian impulse to focus on the person rather than just the body
is actually the moment when disciplinary power achieves its deepest penetration. Foucault suggests that the man we are invited to free is already in himself the effect of a subjection, his individuality, his personality. That's the result of the power mechanisms applied to him.
Wow. Okay, to really appreciate that shift, Foucault says we have to stare directly into the face of what was abandoned. The ritual of supplesse.
Yes, the public torture and execution that was a cornerstone of monarchical power.
And supplesse was so much more than just killing someone.
Oh, far more. It was a complex political ritual, a critical act in what Foucault calls the liturgy of punishment. And its goal was dual and absolutely essential to maintaining the sovereign's authority.
So first, the torturer had to physically mark the victim. It had to leave signs, physical or symbolic, of infamy on the body so the community would witness it and remember the terror of the law.
And second, it had to be a spectacular demonstration of the law's total triumph, the sovereign's omnipotence. The violence was often excessive, protracted, and that was explicitly part of its glory.
So the power was in the excess.
Absolutely. This desire to display absolute power meant that even after death, the punishment kept going. Corpses were dragged, they were burnt, their ashes scattered, or they were exhibited at the roadside to fully destroy the crime and the infamy tied to it.
And this extreme cruelty, it made sense within that old legal framework because a crime wasn't just an injury to another citizen, it was an attack on the sovereign himself.
The sovereign literally embodied the law, the principle of justice. So any crime was an act of treason, a violation of the monarch's character, an attack on his authority.
Which is why the ultimate crime, regicide, an attack on the king's body,
required the summum of all possible tortures, the ultimate punishment. Since the offense against the sovereign was conceptually infinite, the vengeance had to be expressed as infinitely as possible. There was no fixed penalty in the law for it.
The execution of Damiens, the attempted regicide, which Foucault uses to open the book, is just this visceral illustration of that infinite vengeance.
I mean, Damiens was subjected to having his flesh torn with hot pincers, molten lead, and boiling oil poured into his wounds, and then the gruesome attempts by 4 horses to tear him limb from limb.
An ordeal that lasted for hours, and I think ultimately failed, right? The executioner had to step in with a knife.
He did. The whole process was designed to physically crush the body, making the majesty of the power that crushed it visible to every single person watching.
But Foucault points out that this whole spectacle of power had a built-in political contradiction. The horror didn't always produce submission.
It frequently produced the opposite, disturbances around the scaffold.
This is the critical turning point.
It is. The crowd, often the poor, the powerless, who felt abused by the very laws being enforced, they didn't always react with the intended awe. They might cheer for the condemned man, especially if he was perceived as fighting back or, railing against the system.
They might even attack the executioner or the guards.
Right. The scaffold became this momentary stage for what he calls Saturnalia, a brief inversion of order where the condemned, with nothing left to lose, could curse the judges, the laws, the government.
And in doing so, become a popular martyr or hero.
This was especially true for the illustrious criminals, the famous bandits like Marion Le Goff, whose crimes were celebrated in broadsheets and songs. They turned the legal drama into a political protest against the rich and powerful.
So the spectacle, which was designed to display total control,
was actually generating resistance. It was creating solidarity among the lower classes and even organized illegality.
So the spectacle had to be abolished, and not just because of some evolving humanitarian sentiment, sentiment, but because it was politically unstable. It was undermining the very authority it was supposed to reinforce.
Exactly. The reformers realized that to regain control and get rid of all those petty, tolerated illegalities of the lower classes, the vagrants, the beggars, the pickpockets, they first had to break this symbolic solidarity between the criminal and the people.
The people had to be robbed of their old pride in their crimes.
And the only way to do that was to move the entire mechanism of punishment out of public view. Hide it away.
Which brings us to part 2, punishment. The move away from the scaffold wasn't just about reducing violence, it was about creating a functional, generalized system of punishment.
Right, and the reformers launched their critique against that monarchical superpower, where the right to punish was tied to the personal, often arbitrary will of the king.
That old system was seen as inefficient, inconsistent.
Riddled with judicial conflict. The real goal of the reform then was not just leniency. It was to establish a new, more efficient economy of the power to punish.
It had to be regular, predictable, and this is the key part, more detailed in its effects.
Extending discipline throughout the finest grain of the social body. Total saturation.
And this required redefining the crime itself. Instead of an act of defiance against the king, the criminal was now seen as a common enemy, a traitor.
A traitor who had broken the foundational social pact, the agreement made by all citizens.
And that new definition is really formidable because it gives society an absolute right over the criminal, justified by this violation of the communal agreement.
It's the foundation for a pervasive punitive power that is, at the same time, rationalized and universal.
So the new strategy demanded that punishment be a certain and publicly visible consequence of crime. This is the era of Cesare Beccaria, who demanded that the law be inexorable.
Right, eliminating any hope of a pardon, because that just weakens the machinery of the law.
Certainty required a few things. First, transparent, written legislation available to everyone, like a stable monument of the social pact.
And crucially, it required a relentless, coordinated effort between the police and the judiciary. Every crime had to be discovered, every criminal had to be brought to justice, and the reasons for every sentence had to be legible to the public.
The machine of justice had to appear absolutely unstoppable. But Foucault sees this critical internal shift happening here. Even as the focus was supposedly on applying rational law to the criminal act, the whole operation started focusing more and more on the delinquent subject himself.
This is where we move beyond the simple legal framework. The question at trial starts this shift from, okay, did he commit the act? To, wait, what manner of man is this who committed the act?
And the court begins to pull in all these extra juridical factors, the person's biography, their background, their psychology, their moral character.
So we're no longer just punishing the action defined by the law. We're intervening on the individual's intrinsically criminal character, their dangerous state of mind, their inherent criminal tendencies.
And this shift, it necessitated the creation of a whole new class of personnel, right?
Oh, absolutely. Experts like psychiatrists, educators, social workers, people whose job it was to analyze and correct the subjective depths of the individual.
And this process led directly to the creation of the recidivist as the central object of punishment.
Yes. The recidivist wasn't just someone who broke the law twice. They were someone whose fundamental nature was now seen as criminal, whose soul required indefinite correction.
Which means the modern penalty, probation, parole, mandatory treatment, it's often not just to punish the offense. It's to supervise and alter the person's inherent criminal tendencies.
Potentially indefinitely. The intervention continues long after the formal sentence is served. The shift is complete. The old system measured the harm of the act against the sovereign. The new system measures the risk posed by the individual's nature to society.
Okay, so since the spectacular destruction of the body was deemed too politically hazardous, the reformers needed a new method of punitive intervention.
And they developed a system based on representations and signs. This is what Foucault calls the semiotechnique of punishment.
The objective was for punishment to still be a public spectacle, but an intelligible one.
Right, one that taught a moral lesson. Rather than one rooted in bloody vengeance, they wanted punishment to be a calculated obstacle sign that immediately linked the crime to a consequence so obvious and unpleasant that it would just discourage criminal desire.
It sounds like an early form of, behavioral psychology projected onto the entire society. The penalty should speak for itself.
It was a pedagogical dream. The reformers envisioned this punitive city dotted with hundreds of tiny theaters of punishment, everywhere, at crossroads, in gardens, on public roads, even in former mine sites.
And these spaces would use placards and symbols and texts related to the crime to just tirelessly repeat the message of the law.
The idea was that citizens, including families with their children, would visit these sites for a living lesson in order and justice.
And this system was explicitly designed to extinguish that dubious glory that criminals used to have. The old broadsheets and songs celebrating the bandit hero had to be replaced by the image of the re-educated, repentant citizen.
Discourse itself, from moralists, priests, missionaries of eternal reason, would become the constant background noise of universal recoding, reinforcing the love of law, country, and social duty.
That was the ideal vision, a calculated, rational network of signs that deterred crime psychologically.
The paradox, though, is that despite all these highly detailed plans for a specialized, sign-based penalty tailored to specific crimes, what we actually got was the general one-size-fits-all prison. It quickly became the primary penalty.
And the prison was initially rejected by reformers, wasn't it?
Vigorously. It was associated with the arbitrary detentions of the monarchy, the lettre de cachet. They saw it as unjust, prone to abuse. And yet, imprisonment became the answer for everything, leading the critic Chabrud to say it was the same remedy for all ills.
So why did the prison win out over these sophisticated semio techniques? What happened to the punitive city?
Well, the sign system proved too complex to implement universally, and it lacked the institutional grip you need to control an individual's nature.
It was all about the surface, the sign.
Exactly. And this is where the American models, particularly the Philadelphia system like the Walnut Street Prison, became hugely influential.
The Philadelphia model, that introduced the strict architectural partitioning, constant supervision, forced labor.
And moral care, Bibles, clergy visits, mandatory silence.
But crucially, the penalty was carried out in secret.
That was the key break from place. Punishment moved from the public square into this confined, hidden space where it could act directly on the individual's whole being, body, mind, and will.
Solitude and forced self-examination were supposed to act on the convict's conscience.
Right, to transform the prisoner into an agent of useful and resigned activity by creating new, permanent daily habits. The prison became the perfect disciplinary machine.
Which brings us perfectly to part 3, discipline. This is where Foucault really drills down into the precise technology that made the prison in modern society itself possible.
It's the apparatus of discipline. He argues that the classical age discovered the body not just as a medical organism, but as a political object, a target of power relations.
And this recognition gave rise to what he calls a political anatomy, or a mechanics of power.
And the entire purpose was the production of docile bodies that are both more obedient politically and more useful economically. Discipline seeks to manipulate the body's elements, its gestures, its behaviors, through calculated coercion and timing.
Foucault's illustration of the soldier shows this transformation perfectly. The 17th century soldier was valued for his intrinsic physical strength, a blazon of his strength and valor.
But the late 18th century soldier was an engineered, a manufactured figure. The new military regulations, like the Ordinance of 1764, they just broke down the soldier's body into manageable parts for training.
It's a kind of micromanagement of posture.
Total micromanagement. How the arm is turned, how the feet are positioned outwards, the tension in the knee and hamstrings, the requirement to remain motionless for specific periods. This is the birth of the political machine, where the body is trained not just to perform a task, but to exist in a prescribed way.
This meticulous attention to the smallest fragment of life is the heart of discipline. And Foucault identifies 3 key techniques of disciplinary space used to create these docile bodies.
The first is the art of distributions, which starts with enclosure. Discipline requires a specific, heterogeneous place, closed in on itself, the protected, controlled space of monotonous discipline.
Colleges, military barracks.
Even the early factory structures. The comparison of the factory to a monastery or fortress is so revealing. Wilkinson's 1777 factory was designed to master the labor force, with rigorous rules about gate openings and supervision, explicitly to neutralize theft, desertion, and disturbances as labor became more concentrated.
So after enclosure, the second technique is partitioning.
Or elementary location. This is crucial for making individuals calculable. Space gets divided into cells or sections, giving each person a fixed known place, each place its individual.
So it prevents confused multitudes.
And it acts as a constant anti-desertion, anti-vagabondage tactic. It makes every single person visible and identifiable.
And the third technique of distribution is creating functional sites.
Right. Space is coded for maximal supervision, communication, and utility. We see this in military ports and profoundly in hospitals.
How so in hospitals?
In hospitals, the rigorous partitioning separating contagious patients using individual beds led to the individualization of bodies and diseases. Out of this disciplinary control over spatial distribution, a medically useful space was born, allowing for classification and study. This spatial discipline was instrumental in birthing modern clinical medicine.
So beyond controlling space, discipline requires the control of activity, primarily through temporal regulation.
The strict prison timetable we saw earlier is a perfect example.
And we see this through the rigid timetable. It imposes rhythm and repetition.
A technique taken from monastic communities and applied to schools and workshops. Time is systematically broken down and chronometrically measured, demanding maximum speed and utility.
This then moves into body gesture correlation. Discipline demands the single best relation between a gesture and the overall position of the body for peak efficiency.
The smallest actions have to be embedded within the context of a well-disciplined body. The example of handwriting is powerful here.
Right, proper handwriting isn't just a hand movement.
It requires a whole routine involving the fixed position of the feet, the tautness of the knees, the specific grip of the fingers. Every part of the body must be utilized to maximize the utility of that single action. Nothing is allowed to remain idle or useless.
And this leads to exhaustive use. It's not simply about avoiding idleness.
No, it's the principle of maximizing the utility and intensity of every single moment, a positive economy of time.
Then we have the organization of Genesis, which is how training time itself is managed.
This involves breaking time into separate, analytically arranged threads, moving from the simplest to the most complex elements. It replaces the old method of repetition with a principle of elementary progression.
So this is why we have graded examinations in schools. It separates training time into distinct phases of increasing difficulty,
Creating a continuous evolution rather than a series of, solemn analogical events.
and finally, the ultimate goal of all these techniques, the composition of forces.
Discipline moves beyond controlling single bodies and articulates them into an efficient collective machine. This was vital for concentrated industrial production, as Marx noted.
And this military tactical model was projected onto the entire social body to maintain civil peace and order.
It translates the meticulous order of the machine into a political ideal of automatic docility.
Okay, so if those are the techniques for building docile bodies, what are the actual mechanisms or tools Foucault identifies for implementing this discipline? He lists 3 key instruments of correct training. The first is hierarchical observation.
Discipline functions through constant continuous surveillance, but it's not a property owned by the sovereign. It operates like a diffused relational piece of machinery or network. The architectural ideal that informed this was the military camp, with its rigorous geometry designed for total oversight.
This is what led to the prestige of circular architecture in the 18th century. It expressed a powerful political utopia.
The utopia of how to maximize visibility for the supervisor while keeping the supervisor discreet, minimizing the cost of surveillance.
The power is everywhere and always alert, leaving no zone of shade.
Exactly. The gaze is continuous, acting like a relational physics of power, operating according to geometric and mechanical laws. The system, not the person, guarantees the oversight.
The second instrument is normalizing judgment, which enforces a penality of the norm. This is critical because it introduces the concept of infrapenality.
Traditional law ignored a huge mass of behaviors that disciplinary power targeted: untidiness, sloth, incorrect posture, idle talk, basically any deviation from the expected efficiency and moral standards.
This is a penalty of the norm, not the law of crime.
Right. Punishment is defined by deviation from a rule that functions as a minimal threshold, an average, or an optimum.
And this isn't just about punishment, it's about comparison and ranking.
Absolutely. Normalizing judgment measures and hierarchizes individuals based on value, ability, and nature. It uses systems of rewards and punishments, not to enforce legal statutes, but to make the action of the institution, the school, the factory, the prison effective.
Like creating the shameful class in schools or rankings in military maneuvers.
Disciplinary power compares, differentiates, hierarchizes, and fundamentally it normalizes individuals against an optimum standard.
And the third, and maybe the central instrument that ties the first two together, is the examination. Foucault calls it the core ritual that fuses hierarchical observation and normalizing judgment.
The examination is the fixing at once ritual and scientific of individual differences. You see its rise everywhere. Hospital visits became daily, regular, and required documentation. The hospital transformed into a place of perpetual examination, instantly granting the physician authority over the religious staff.
And the examination isn't just a show of power, it's a massive engine for knowledge production.
That is the core paradox. It transforms the exercise of power into the extraction and production of knowledge. The administrator, the teacher, the doctor, the governor gets massive amounts of information about the subject. The rise of the systematic hospital examination enabled the epistemological thaw of modern medicine, just as the school examination was critical to the development of pedagogy as a science.
And this requires intensive writing and documentation.
Registers, reports, biographical files. This disciplinary writing creates a permanent corpus of knowledge about the individual's specific aptitudes, abilities, and evolution. This documentation is what creates the calculable man.
The examination constitutes the individual as a fully describable, analyzable object.
And this, Foucault argues, leads to a profound historical reversal. In a disciplinary system, the child is more individualized, more observed, and more documented than the adult. The patient more than the healthy man, and the delinquent more than the normal man.
That's a radical concept. The individuality that the human sciences study, psychology, sociology, criminology, it isn't some timeless, discovered essence.
It is the result of the observation and writing practices of disciplinary power. The sciences of man were born precisely at this moment. The shift from the individuality of the memorable man, the heroes, saints, and kings, to that of the calculable man.
Which brings us to the theoretical and architectural manifestation of this new, diffused power structure. Jeremy Bentham's brilliant and terrifying design, the Panopticon.
The Panopticon is often mistaken for just a prison building. Foucault stresses that it's a generalized functional mechanism intended to improve the exercise of power by making it lighter, more rapid, and fundamentally more effective across any institution.
And the genius of the Panopticon lies in its core principle. Power should be both visible and unverifiable.
It's visible because the inmate in their peripheral cell constantly sees the central tower, ensuring the theoretical permanence of the gaze. But it's unverifiable because the inmate can never know if they're actually being watched at any given moment.
And that uncertainty is the mechanism of control.
Right. The constant awareness of potential surveillance guarantees the submission of the subjects through their own psychological self-monitoring.
This mechanism renders the whole ceremonial display of the sovereign's power obsolete. You don't need the executioner anymore.
You don't. The surveillance is guaranteed by the architecture and its internal psychological mechanisms. And because the machine functions automatically through uncertainty, it doesn't even matter who exercises power. Any official, or even the director's family, could theoretically staff the central tower and maintain the exact same effect.
Power becomes detached from the person of the ruler.
It becomes purely relational.
To emphasize just how new this design was, Foucault contrasts the Panopticon with the historical model of the quarantine city during the plague.
The plague city was a crisis model. A segmented, immobile, frozen space with exhaustive, continuous registration designed to fight total existential disorder. The cost of surveillance was enormous. It required massive external force just to keep people fixed in place.
The Panopticon, on the other hand, generalizes this analysis of disorder, but applies it in a flexible and economic way.
It's a formula for generalizing discipline, a principle of political technology, an arrangement of individuals in relation to one another that functions without recourse to external force.
It's designed to be integrated into any function: school, factory, asylum, prison.
And it subtly increases the efficiency of that function simply by enforcing constant docility and self-monitoring.
This leads us to the carceral extension. The panoptic principle didn't just stay within the penitentiary walls. It permeated non-disciplinary spaces, colonizing the cracks in the social body.
The panoptic mechanism ensured that the exercise of power wasn't an external constraint. It became internal. The disciplines, the timetables, the partitioning, the examinations became infrastructure, increasing the useful size of populations while decreasing the inconveniences of power. This is how the machinery of power operates, minute and immense on the underside of the law.
So, tracing the path Foucault laid out for us, from the political instability of the scaffold all the way to the perfect self-governance of the panopticon, we arrive at the culmination, the carceral network.
And the carceral network is not just the prison building itself.
Right. It's a massive decentralized web of institutions, almshouses, hospitals, schools, reformatories, barracks, workshops that enforces disciplinary coercion throughout society.
It creates a continuum between everyday life and incarceration. Through this system of classification, registration, and supervision, power becomes omnipresent, omniscient.
The delinquent is no longer an outlaw figure who defies the law from the outside.
No. Foucault suggests that the delinquent, who is produced by this very disciplinary system, is not outside the law. He is, from the very outset, in the law, at the very heart of the law.
But Foucault argues this system is designed, maybe inadvertently, to fail by constantly producing a specialized class of criminals.
The prison, by perpetuating recidivism and creating this special milieu of former convicts, actively generates delinquency. And this generated delinquency is paradoxically useful to the political and economic order.
That is the truly provocative conclusion. How is it useful?
Well, delinquency serves a few key functions. First, it helps manage other popular illegalities, the everyday illegal practices of the poor that were previously tolerated.
By marking the professional criminal as alien, morally corrupt, and dangerous.
The system traces a clear moral line between the petty, tolerated illegality of the people and the serious foreign threat of delinquency. It separates the two, preventing popular solidarity.
And second, this predictable, observable milieu of former convicts is used directly as an instrument for police supervision.
Absolutely. The police relied heavily on former delinquents as informers and agents. Figures like Vidocq, the famous criminal who became the chief of the Sûreté, perfectly illustrate this symmetry. Delinquency is constituted as an enclosed, observable milieu and then transformed into a political tool for managing and spying on the rest of the population.
So the ultimate takeaway here is that the shift from spectacular torture to the modern carceral system signals the rise of a whole new ambition for power.
A different kind of power. The ideal punishment is no longer the finite, violent display of sovereign power, but an indefinite discipline.
An interrogation without end.
A meticulous and ever more analytical observation that continues long beyond the formal sentence. The modern ambition of power is not simply to eliminate crime, but to manage and produce the criminal, the calculable, documented, and docile individual as a permanent, useful element of social control.
An element ready to be deployed, monitored, and normalized wherever power needs to maximize its effects.